Hello and welcome everyone to the Monday Morning General Podcast, where we give you the play-by-play analysis on battles from antiquity to the 20th century. I'm Brendon and that's Bjorn. Let's jump in. So in this series, we're going to be covering the Battle of Antietam, otherwise known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, occurring in 1862 during the U.S. Civil War. Today we're going to be talking about the events that lead up to the battle, but before we do that, Bjorn, I want to discuss with you why Antietam was so significant. So I know this is one of your favorite battles in all of history, so I'm going to just throw it over to you. Why is it so significant?
Yeah, man. So you're absolutely right. This is one of my absolute favorite battles in history, just from a point of, I think people discount its significance a little bit, but just the way that the battle occurred and some of the real impressive aspects of this battle. So first, when you put the Battle of Antietam, otherwise known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, that's a really cool kind of little thumbnail note. When you're talking about these battles, early battles of the American Civil War, they were known as different things by both the North and the South. So the Northerners, they called this battle the Battle of Antietam, while as the Southerners called it the Battle of Sharpsburg. Now, generally speaking, there are a couple exceptions to the rules, and especially later on at the end of this war, the names of the battles start to become more on the same page. But the North would utilize key land features in their battles, in the naming of their battles, whereas the Southerners would use cities. So, for example, you've got the first Battle of Bull Run, that's named after a river or a creek that is called Bull Run. That's what the Northerners called it, whereas the Southerners called it the Battle of Manassas Junction, which was the name of a junction of some rail lines. So kind of cool to keep in the back of your mind. A little bit of a fun fact. The Battle of Antietam, referred to by the Northerners, that's Antietam Creek. It's a little river that runs through the battle. And then the Battle of Sharpsburg by the Southerners, the battle took place near the city of Sharpsburg in Maryland. Yep. So just a really kind of silly, fun fact for you to put in your back pocket. But really, let's talk about the significance here. So I'm going to go out on a ledge here, Brendon, and maybe you can disagree with me a little bit on this, but I'm going to make the comment that the Battle of Antietam is more significant to the outcome of the American Civil War than the Battle of Gettysburg is. Now, many people today look at Gettysburg and they're like, "Oh, that was the last hurrah of the Confederacy. That was their high water. They call it the high tide or the high water mark of the Confederacy. This is where the Confederacy was never stronger." Well, I'm going to disagree, and I'm going to say that it was a year prior, the Battle of Antietam. This battle right here was the nail in the coffin of the Confederacy that basically put it on a downward trajectory. At the end of this battle, the outcome of this battle resulted in a scenario in which the South had no realistic chance of winning. So I'll define it a little bit better here. What we're seeing is prior to this battle, you've got Robert E. Lee taking over in the summer of 1862. So remember, there was this 7 days campaign. George B. McClellan, the Union general, he's down by Richmond. He's within miles of Richmond, and he's advancing. And it takes
Richmond is the capital of the Confederacy.
That's right. Yep. The capital of the Confederacy. He is within miles. He can see the church bells of the capital of the Confederate States of America. Now, understand, the reason why Richmond was so vital was because it was a huge hub of manufacturing in the South. It was one of the almost a majority of manufacturing capabilities was in Richmond. The Tredegar Iron Works was one of the only ironworks in the South capable of creating weapons such as cannons. So it was a vital hub. You captured the capital of Richmond in the first or second year of the Civil War, and this bad boy's over. Okay, so that's what we're looking at early on in the early summer of 1862. And Joseph Johnston, the general in charge of defending Richmond, he's injured and he's replaced by Robert E. Lee. Now, Robert E. Lee, he was a stunning general during the Civil War, but originally, he had earned a nickname called Granny Lee, or the Queen of Spades, through some of his actions at the very beginning of the American Civil War. It was a lackluster performance, but he takes over command of this army and he does amazing things with it. He is actually capable of pushing McClellan out of the peninsula. It was very, very costly, but in the end, we pushed him out. He pushed him out, got him to get out of the Richmond area, and then he quickly reevaluates and realizes that not only did McClellan have an army on the peninsula, but there was another guy named John Pope who had an army up by Manassas. And so now he has to reassert his attention towards Manassas. So great victory for Lee in the peninsula. He moves up. He goes to Manassas, great, outstanding victory for the Confederacy there at Manassas for the Second Battle of Bull Run. And then from there, he's looking at a scenario in which the entire eastern theater of the Civil War, there are almost no Union soldiers in Virginia.
For the first time since 61, right?
Yeah. So he's looking at a scenario where they have the capability of going onto the offensive, to go into Maryland, to go into the North, to bring the war to the North. And these are important for a couple key reasons. But the one I'd like to really point to is in the late summer of 1862, European nations were looking at whether they should recognize the Confederacy as a nation. Remember, during the American Revolution, when the Americans won the Battle of Saratoga, France recognized us as a nation. They said, this country, the United States of America, we recognize them. That is a huge portion of why we were capable of winning the revolution. And a similar scenario may have occurred in the late summer of 1862.
What benefits would the Confederacy have gotten if they would have received that recognition?
That's a huge benefit to a Southern nation where right now there were a lot of legal confusion as to putting down a rebellion as opposed to fighting a war against two nations. So you're talking about interstate commerce between the Confederate States of America and Great Britain would have been drastically changed had the British actually recognized the Confederacy as a nation. It would have allowed them to outwardly provide loans. They would have been able to sell weapons without kind of circumventing the situation. They would have been able to sell ships to the Confederacy in a more broad way. So the British created a lot of ships for the South. A lot of the Southern naval vessels were produced in Great Britain, but they had to do it through purchasing from third parties, right. From Sweden or whatever. We had to we had to see it go through.
It's a very complicated back channel to get ships from the UK to the South.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we got back channeling going on in order to get these ships. So that would have changed. Trade would have changed. The blockade would have been affected by nations actually identifying and moving towards recognizing the Confederacy. But not only that, we would have seen more ambassadors saying, we're from France and we would like to negotiate a truce between the North and the South for seeking the Confederacy as independent. So what really happened is during this
the biggest point, right? To have someone recognize your territory as your territory and then to make the two parties come to the table to agree on terms. That was the thing that would have killed the Union.
Oh, yeah. It would have been devastating. The British ambassadors sitting down and saying, I'd like to broker peace with the goal of making the Confederacy independent.
Yeah.
That would have been a crazy scenario to find yourself. And what actually was going on is as Lee was invading the North in 1862, the British cabinet was actually sitting there discussing whether they should recognize the Confederacy.
And basically waiting on news from this campaign.
That's exactly what it was. A cabinet member stood up and said, General Lee is invading the North as we speak. I move that we pause this conversation until we realize the outcome of this bill. And that's what the major significance of this engagement is.
Yeah.
There are a couple different reasons why he's going to invade the North, but that, in my mind, is the biggest significance to this battle, in that had the Confederacy won this battle, it is maybe not highly likely, but there is an increased chance that the European nations at the time would have recognized the South as an independent nation, and it would have been much harder for the Union to win. Yeah. Well, on the other side of the coin, there is a plausible scenario in which, had the Confederacy been completely annihilated in this battle, that the conversation of the emancipation of the slaves
doesn't happen.
Not have happened.
Mm-hmm.
Because during the year 1862, the Union was not fighting to free the slaves. The Union was fighting to bring the South back. Mm-hmm. Remember, Abraham Lincoln is going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation as a result of their performance at the Battle of Antietam. Had Lee's entire army been destroyed, the war would have essentially been over at that point in time, and there would have been no need for Abraham Lincoln to have freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. So this is a key battle that had it gone either way, would have had outstanding significance Whereas what happened resulted in this war lasting for another 2.5 years and hundreds of thousands of deaths and the way we see it today. Whereas
and then also the emancipation of slavery.
Right.
And, the South becoming back a part of the Union again.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's just the fork in the road. This is one of the scenarios in which had it turned left, could have gone one way. Had it turned right, could have gone the other way. But instead it was like a subtle, we leaned over one way and continued going straight.
Yeah.
And it resulted in massive casualties. So one of my favorite battles to discuss, one of my favorite battles to look at and to research, because there are so many different scenarios that could have taken place had this been just a little bit different.
So let's jump into it. So like you said, this follows the battles of McClellan at the 7 Days Campaign during the Peninsular Campaign, and then the Northern Virginia Campaign, like where you said Lee defeated Pope. So we're going to be talking about the Maryland Campaign today, and this can be seen as the last film of the trilogy for the summer campaigns of 1862. So following the Second Battle of Bull Run, like you said, Lee had a massive advantage. The Union had left Virginia, no more Union troops in the South. So Lee moves north with his 55,000 men through the Shenandoah Valley up to Maryland. So this was on September 4th, 1862. And his main objectives here were to resupply his army outside of the war-torn Virginia theater, which had been seeing battles constantly since 1861 with the First Battle of Bull Run. So the farm fields, the agriculture, the troops, or the food that's available in Virginia is very limited, and it's hard to keep an army in the field with not a lot of food. So he wants to move the battle to Maryland to potentially open up some new places for him to supply his army, to damage the Northern morale in anticipation of the November elections that are coming up in 2 months.
And remember, when a midterm occurs, as they saw in 1862, they're going to see the Democrats gaining ground in both the House and the Senate, but it's not going to be an overwhelming majority. So what could have happened had Lee completely annihilated McClellan or even performed at a rate that was seen as an outstanding victory, we could have seen a midterm election that would have been vastly different. We could have seen the Democrats taking control in the House and in the Senate and then forcing peace terms.
Other things that Lee was looking for was potentially inciting uprising in slave-holding state Maryland, where the capital of the Union was, Washington, D.C., and then also, like you said, Bjorn, to seek European recognition as a legitimate state in the Confederacy.
So it's important, when we're also talking about inciting an uprising in Maryland, it's important to recognize that Lee and his generals and the Southern government basically believed that Maryland was on a tipping point where they would have potentially joined. The area that Lee invaded actually had no interest whatsoever in joining the Confederacy. It was more the guys from Baltimore, which is kind of on the eastern side of Maryland. They were the more of the hot-headed individuals, but the people on the western side of Maryland, where Lee is going to invade, because remember the Shenandoah Valley kind of comes out in that western portion, they were a lot more tame with the idea of not seceding from the Union. So there was no realistic chance of Maryland seceding with regard to this invasion. But when we're talking about food, getting out of Virginia during the prime agricultural season was very important, because Lee knew that he was going to have to rely on Virginian agriculture to get him through the next winter. And in order to do that, he went up into the north, and he actually obtained copious amounts of supplies. Actually, about when he came back, he brought about 6 weeks worth of supplies with him from the north. So he lived, even though his army was not necessarily defeated, but they didn't win in Maryland. They did not win in Maryland, but he actually brought about 6 weeks worth of provisions back into Virginia with him. So he sustained himself during the entirety of this campaign, and then he brought back enough to sustain himself for another 6 weeks, which is almost a victory in itself when you're talking about how strapped the South would be for supplies.
After Pope is defeated at Second Bull Run on September 2nd, Abraham Lincoln named George McClellan to command the fortifications of Washington and all the troops for the defense of the capital. The appointment was controversial in the cabinet, a majority of whom signed a petition declaring to the president our deliberate opinion that, at this time, it is not safe to entrust to Major General McClellan the command of any army of the United States. The president admitted that it was like curing the bite with the hair of the dog, but Lincoln told his secretary, John Hay, "We must use what tools we have. There is no man in the army who can man these fortifications and lick these troops of ours into shape half as well as he. If he can't fight himself, he excels in making others ready to fight." We probably should just take a moment here, Bjorn, talk about George McClellan. He failed at the Peninsula Campaign, and it seems like nobody in Washington is like super excited to have this dude leading the defense of the Capitol.
Yeah, Brendon. That's the thing that's so interesting when you're looking at Abraham Lincoln and his actions during the Civil War. He spent a phenomenal amount of time, about 3.5 years, looking for a general who would just fight, someone who would just fight. He's going to go through generals right.
He was looking for a Lee, right?
He was looking for someone who could fight against Lee just like Lee would fight against himself.
Yeah,
and he couldn't find it. We went through McDowell and then McClellan and then Pope, back to McClellan, Ambrose Burnside,
yep.
And then we'll talk
about Fredericksburg probably in the future.
Just all of these generals he's moving through trying to find himself someone who will fight. And then he finds that man in Ulysses S. Grant, who's out in Virginia. And although Ulysses S. Grant's going to see some controversies on himself, Lincoln, again, will defend Grant by saying, I need this man. He will fight.
Yep.
Whereas we've got guys who won't fight here. But I love what he said to John Hay, to the secretary. He said, we must use the tools that we have, but then he recognizes that if he can't fight himself, he excels in making others ready to fight. George McClellan was very intelligent. He was high up in his class in West Point. He was an engineer, brilliant man. But I kind of look at it as, when you've got these little 6-7-year-old playing with plastic army men, he loved setting up his men and he was afraid to knock them down. So he was terrified of losing his army. He was terrified of losing his men, but he was really great at setting up his armies. And
which is probably a good thing when you're defending the Capitol.
Oh, yeah. But also his men were incredibly endeared to him because they knew that their lives were not going to be wastefully thrown away. Well, at the same time, his lack of aggressiveness actually cost more lives. Yeah. He would have been so much better off had he been just an ounce more aggressive. But they knew that he was not going to waste their lives to the point where he was almost too timid. He was not a great battlefield general. He would have done better as like the chief of the army, something like that, where he could have been in charge, something like what General Winfield Scott was.
Or what Lee was before he became a field general.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
McClellan's a perfect staff officer, not a good battlefield commander.
McClellan's in command of the defense of Washington now. So Lee moves his army into Maryland, and this is controversial too. So he divides his army into 4 separate echelons as he moves into Maryland. So he received intelligence of militia activity in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. So Lee sends Major General James Longstreet up to Boonesboro and then into Hagerstown. He sends Major General Thomas Stonewall Jackson to seize the Union arsenal at Harper's Ferry with 3 separate columns. So this left 2 units. So the first is the thinly spread cavalry of Major General Jeb Stuart and a division of Major General D.H. Hill to guard the Army's rear at South Mountain. So that's interesting too, because when you look at like the rear of the Army as at South Mountain, well, that's quickly going to become the front of the Army as we move into the further Maryland campaign. But so the way that the Army is situated with Jeb Stuart between Lee and McClellan, so Jeb Stuart's, northwest of Washington, D.C., D.H. Hill near Stone Mountain, and then Stonewall Jackson and Longstreet further south to Hagerstown and to Harper's Ferry. So he splits his army. So they're pretty far, geographically with these 4 different units in Maryland.
Right, but again, remember they're split because they're working as locusts on the ground. They're trying to grab supplies. They're trying to make sure that they make it through the wintertime. And we're gonna run into a couple issues here with how thinly spread these guys are. But remember, McClellan is slow. McClellan is slow, and so they thought they'd have extra time in order to gather those supplies than what they turned out having to do. And that dealt with a different scenario entirely that we'll get to.
Yeah. Lee enters Maryland. He initially leaves for Maryland with 55,000 men, but he sees his strength start to weaken almost right away with straggling and desertion. So he left Chantilly with 55,000 men. Within 10 days, he's lost 10,000. So he's down to 45,000. Some of these troops refuse to cross the Potomac River because they see an invasion of the Union territory as a violation of their beliefs that they were fighting to defend their states from northern aggression. A bunch of others become ill with things like diarrhea from eating unripe green corn from the Maryland fields, or they fell out because they didn't have any shoes as they're walking on these hard surface northern roads. So they lose 10,000 men as they're before they even get to Maryland, or right as they get into Maryland.
Right. Well, and remember, you've got this thing, we call it the Maryland campaign, but you could essentially spread this out and call it the summer campaign of 1862, because in June, they're fighting a major campaign. In July, they're fighting a major campaign. And then they move in August. It's like, this is, the end of August, they're moving in. This is very strenuous on soldiers who can't ride in trucks. They're not riding in trucks. They're marching on the ground. So this is very, very strenuous. And Lee is really pushing his army to a breaking point at this time. And we are going to see that army in the form of straggling, desertions. That's going to be the major issue here in this battle.
One thing to note here is they get into Maryland and they're expecting to maybe start a rebellion in, a public uprising. Like you said, Bjorn, that does not happen. They are not in the slave holding part of Maryland. So it's a very, we'll just say, uncool attitude towards the Confederate invasion of the North. So they're dealing with that. Jeb Stuart is not very effective during this point in doing any sort of reconnoitering against the Northern defenses. So he does not know where McClellan is, where his elements are. On the flip side, McClellan also not good at recon. And so they are kind of looking past each other. McClellan thinks that the Confederates have like 102,000 men. And so he thinks they're huge, and he's very scared to leave Washington to pursue them. And then Lee can't really make a decision because Jeb Stuart is not doing a very good job of actually going out and identifying where that frontline trace of the Union Army is. So with that being said, McClellan does move out of Washington starting on September 7th with his 87,000 men in a very lethargic pursuit of the Confederates. He's, like you said, a very naturally cautious general, and he thought that he was facing 102,000 Confederates, which is like almost, that's way over double what is actually on the field.
Yeah, and if you actually look into the numbers, the estimates that are individuals that are involved in this battle in itself, it's almost 3 times. So he almost believes that he's outnumbered in itself, but then he believes that Lee has about 2 or 3 times as many soldiers as he actually possesses. So this is where his cautiousness is going to cost him the battle.
So he leaves Washington on September 7th. During this time, Stonewall Jackson is given the mission to take and seize Harper's Ferry. So between September 12th and 15th, Stonewall Jackson surrounds, bombards, and captures Harper's Ferry. And it's a very small Union element there.
Well, by very small, it's about 12,000, which is small in Civil War Army terms, but is about as big as the entire Army was prior to the Civil War. But if you've ever been to Harper's Ferry, it is the worst defensible position ever, and it's almost an embarrassment that McClellan just left those soldiers there. There is no way that Harper's Ferry can defend itself from a siege. If you look at the battle,
they're completely surrounded.
Yeah, Harper's Ferry is completely surrounded by high ground, in immensely high ground. Once Jackson got his cannon into position on those high bluffs, there was no chance, and they surrendered. So, but what it really is Lee is telling Jackson, hurry up, get them surrendered, and then get going back to the battle. And this is something that's going to play in really importantly at the end of this battle.
Could Lee have bypassed Harper's Ferry and left it there?
Oh, he absolutely could have. But the question is, how would that have affected the outcome of this battle? Jackson was present during the Battle of Antietam. He could have bypassed it. There's not a whole lot that 12,000 men in the interior of the Confederate lines, especially with generals as lackluster as the ones who are leading. I highly doubt that the commander of those 12,000 men, he surrendered as soon as those cannons were up on the bluffs. I highly doubt he would have been running around in the rear of Lee. But at the same time, 12,000 surrendered Union soldiers, that's the largest surrendering of American soldiers in history up until the Philippines during World War II.
The interesting thing here is once you capture enemy soldiers, you got to deal with them. And with where Lee's army was positioned, they were between Harper's Ferry and Washington, D.C. I don't think there was any sort of real lines of communication back and forth. So I think those Union soldiers, units that were at Harper's Ferry could not talk to McClellan. The lines were cut. They were not sending runners. So there was no way to communicate back and forth. So I think Lee could have left him there and had Stonewall Jackson's unit with him at South Mountain to better repel the Union force at this Battle of South Mountain that we're going to talk about in a second.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge point. The Battle of South Mountain, I mean, the Union's going to win that one, but almost just barely. And that's what's so embarrassing. When you look at the numbers of the individuals involved, it's nearly embarrassing that the Union almost didn't succeed.
Yeah. So let's get into this a little bit. So the Army of the Potomac, which is what we're calling McClellan's army right now, reaches Frederick, Maryland on September 13th. There, a Corporal Barton Mitchell of the 27th Indiana Infantry discovers a mislaid copy of the detailed campaign plans of Lee's army, Special Order 191, wrapped around 3 cigars. So before the Confederates moved north out of Frederick, Lee had written his orders 191 to detail out what the rest of this Maryland campaign is going to look like, right? He gives orders to Stonewall, he gives orders to D.H. Hill, he gives orders to Longstreet and to Jeb Stuart, and he tells all of them what the plans are. He writes the orders down. These get transcribed onto like 5 or 6 different pieces of paper given to runners. So we're talking secret or top secret documents that need to get to these generals so they can start creating their battle plans. And one of them gets lost.
And that's what's so ridiculous about this story. Like, this is almost like novel worthy of an event, because this order right here was seen as so vital to the success of the campaign that James Longstreet, upon receiving it, he read it, he memorized it, and then he ate it. That is how important that order was, and that's how it's just a complete and utter, just ridiculous that someone would have lost this order when James Longstreet's eating it because it's that important, and someone loses it.
So the order indicated that Lee had divided his army and dispersed portions of them geographically, that we talked about earlier, thus making each individual element of his army subject to isolation and defeat in detail. So upon realizing the intelligence value of this discovery, McClellan throws up his arms and says, "Now I know what to do." He waved the order at his old army friend, Brigadier General John Gibbon, and said, "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." He then telegraphs President Lincoln, "I have the whole rebel force in front of me, but I am confident, and no time shall be lost. I think Lee has made a gross mistake, and that he will be severely punished for it. I have all the plans of the rebels, and will catch them in their own trap. If my men are equal to the emergency, we'll send you trophies." McClellan waited 18 hours before deciding to take advantage of this intelligence, and his delay squanders the opportunity to destroy Lee's army in detail at South Mountain.
Now, Brendon, you received this order. What should you do?
Oh my God! You start making plans immediately. You start moving. You send your reconnaissance out to gain contact with the enemy, identify his front line of trace, and then attack. That's what you do.
So you're talking about you get this order and you immediately pull up your 10 stakes.
Right. You know that Stonewall Jackson's at Harper's Ferry. You know Longstreet's up in Hagerstown. So you know that all that Lee has left is Jeb Stuart's cavalry and who is it? D.H. Hill at South Mountain.
So one of the most irresponsible things that McClellan could have done is waiting even 1 hour.
And look how confident he is talking to Lincoln.
Yeah.
I have them right where we want them.
Well, go get them, guy.
Go get
them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's going to send Lincoln trophies. I wonder what Lincoln thought when he heard this too. I have the plans of the rebels. That is also kind of a vague thing. He didn't say exactly what he received to Lincoln. So it feels like it was a little bit of cover your butt kind of situation here too.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So McClellan does start moving though. He does get his army going, but it takes 18 hours when he really should have gotten his army moving within hours. So Lee, seeing McClellan's uncharacteristic aggressive actions and possibly learning through a Confederate sympathizer that his order had been compromised, quickly moved to concentrate his army. He chose not to abandon his invasion and return to Virginia yet, because Jackson still was out capturing Harper's Ferry. So instead, Lee chooses to make a stand at Sharpsburg, Maryland, and in the meantime, the elements of the Army of Northern Virginia waited a defense at the passes of South Mountain. So South Mountain is a kind of a large piece of terrain on the Appalachian Mountain between Sharpsburg and Frederick, Maryland. So Lee is concentrating himself, the headquarters of the Confederate Army in Sharpsburg, but he has his elements forward up in the passes, where it is constrained terrain, where the Union has to go through these passes to get to Sharpsburg.
So he's blocking these passes as he's scrambling to bring his men. Right,
because he needs to buy time to get Jackson to Sharpsburg or to South Mountain. So he's trying to buy time.
What would have happened if McClellan would have moved immediately? and not given 18 hours to consolidate his forces, what do you think could have happened?
If he would have shown any sort of tempo, he could have gone through the passes before defense was set up and spilled into Sharpsburg almost immediately without having to set up an actual integrated attack.
And then we're talking about destroying these units in detail. We're talking
Right.
about 83,000
Right. So instead of trying to fight 45,000 Confederates in one single position, you're fighting groups of probably 10,000 at multiple locations. With McClellan has 102,000 soldiers. 102,000 versus 10,000 is a good ratio for the attack.
So major mistake made right here. Check the
Right.
block. Biggest mistake, 18 hours.
Okay, so pitched battles were fought on September 14th for possession of the South Mountain Passes. So there's 3 gaps. There's Crampton's, Turner's, and Fox gaps. Major General D.H. Hill defended Turner and Fox gaps against Burnside. And then to the south, Major General Lafayette McLaws defended Crampton's gap against Franklin, who was able to break through at Crampton's gap. But the Confederates were able to hold Turner and Fox's gaps, very precariously, but they held them. Lee realized the futility of the position against the numerically superior Union force and orders his troops to Sharpsburg. McClellan now was in a position to theoretically destroy Lee's army before it could concentrate at Sharpsburg. McClellan's limited activity on September 15th after the victory at South Mountain condemns the garrison at Harper's Ferry to capture and gives Lee time to unite his scattered divisions at Sharpsburg.
Wait a second. So what you're telling me is that McClellan not only waits to move his army upon receiving this vital piece of intel that Lee's army scattered, but then he captures these gaps and then he delays even further?
And Harper's Ferry has not been captured yet. So he theoretically could have destroyed Lee's army and saved his position at Harper's Ferry.
Right, because imagine Harper's Ferry is not captured yet. You push through these gaps. All of a sudden, Lee says, my position in Maryland is untenable. I need to fall back.
Right.
Falls back into Virginia. And guess who's coming with him? Jackson.
Right.
He has to come with him. So basically, bottom line for this entire campaign up to now is the longer you delay, the less your chances of victory.
Right. You're getting rid of all of your opportunity advantage. On September 15th, Stonewall Jackson takes possession of Harper's Ferry and more than 12,000 Union prisoners. He then leads most of his men to join Lee at Sharpsburg, leaving Major General A.P. Hill's division to complete the occupation of Harper's Ferry. So on the 15th, what we're looking at here, Confederate forces at Sharpsburg, Union forces on South Mountain, and then Stonewall Jackson in Harper's Ferry en route to Sharpsburg. So that's kind of where we're going to leave off this conversation, just in terms of disposition of these two forces.
Now, these 12,000 Union prisoners, each one of them's coming with, now, what is A.P. Hill doing when he's completing this occupation? He's signing paroles for these 12,000 men. Remember, back in the early portions of this war, you obtained a parole where you promised not to fight until you were legally exchanged.
He's taking weapons, he's taking ammunition, taking food, and he's sending them out because they don't have the ability to set up any sort of POW camp.
Now, at this point in time, had Lee just withdrawn out of Maryland, I mean, he could put a feather in his cap on this. 12,000 Union soldiers captured.
Right.
That was not quite as big as Fort Donaldson, but that's a massive amount of men that you could then exchange with your parole tickets with these officers who are doing the parole. So I'm looking at this as like, there's a lot of ambition, and Robert E. Lee is absolutely audacious when he's continuing this. But kind of the theme in my mind is that he's almost performing a foolhardy action here, moving against McClellan and holding this town. It would have been so simple.
McClellan's got at least 2-to-1 odds, probably closer to 3-to-1 odds on Lee. And when we talk about, in modern Army doctrine, when we talk about an army going on the attack, we look to have a ratio of 3-to-1 to have a successful attack. And McClellan is pretty damn close to that 3-to-1 ratio to have a successful attack here.
Yeah. And so basically where we're at right now, we've got Lee scurrying to consolidate his forces on the northern side of the river there in Sharpsburg, Maryland.
Messenger horses got to be just run ragged with how much Lee's trying to communicate with his divisions.
And we've got McClellan slowly plodding along like he always does.
Yeah.
But these armies are going to meet and they're going to smash into each other. And that is where I'm telling you, we'll talk about it next time, but I'm telling you, this is where the Confederacy lost the American Civil War.
Even without losing the battle.
That's right. Even without losing the battle, this is where the South loses the Civil War.
I wonder if Lee could have done all of this, but then instead of waiting at Sharpsburg, like you said, retrograde back into Virginia, but then, put the marketing and the branding on this to say it was a raid into the North.
And it's so funny because one would think you lose a major battle or something like this happens, and it severely tarnishes your reputation.
Yeah.
What we're going to see is that this battle is going to cause massive Southern casualties, and he will not be held responsible for these losses. His reputation will survive past this. So I am a firm believer that had he withdrawn, called it a raid, Lee's reputation would have been just as sound at the end of this as what it was when he fought this battle.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap up this week in our discussion of the Maryland campaign, the prelude to the Battle of Antietam. So hit that subscribe button so you get the next episode where we watch the Union cross the Antietam Creek and the Confederates defend Sharpsburg. MMG out.